Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Iron Coffins part 38. August the 6th, 1944. It was 10:20 p.m. Only a few sailors were on deck to cast off the lines. I stood on the bridge of U-953 expecting Winter's farewell visit. At 10:29 p.m. he stepped aboard. He returned my salute and said firmly, "Take good care of your men and the boat, and good luck." "I wish you the same, Captain. Hope we meet again soon under better circumstances. Let the future decide. Make sure you get out of here before it's too late." A few brief orders, the lines were cast off the bollards and the gangway was pushed back to the pier. U-953 silently slipped from its berth. It moved quietly into a night full of uncertainties and into the middle of Brest Harbor, slowly, carefully, silently, so as not to activate any of the acoustic mines. I brought the boat to a stop, climbed into the tower, and then had it routinely submerged to depth by my executive officer for the trim test. The conditions in the narrow steel tubes were catastrophic. They had nothing to do with good seamanship or the safety regulations for submarines. The central passage was blocked by equipment and instruments. Communication between the various compartments was interrupted. The heavy weight of the additional cargo and the doubled crew caused my experienced engineer extraordinary difficulties. It took him over an hour to establish the necessary trim and buoyancy to prepare for all potential hazards. U-953 surfaced and crept into the shadow of an escort vessel, one of the last available patrol boats in French waters. The night was moonless and black, and the patrol boat picked up speed, and U-953 followed in its wake. After we'd passed the underwater net, I switched to the diesel engines. As the cliffs receded into the night, radar signals came rushing at us from directly ahead. I knew we had already been discovered. Suddenly, a flare shot up into the night blue sky 200 meters ahead of our bow. At the same moment, our escort vessel signaled, "Caution! English torpedo boats in attack position. Man all guns." I hadn't expected to encounter the English this way. All my calculations were suddenly ruined, and without hesitation I ordered, "Surface to search for torpedo boats. Permission to fire without further orders." The flare extinguished, the water and night became as black as before. The patrol boat stopped, forcing me to do the same. We were suddenly exposed to a danger we couldn't see, a devilish feeling. Firing directly ahead was impossible with our weapons, as the conning tower was in the line of fire. To concentrate my full firepower on the enemy, I had to turn the boat 180 degrees and face its stern seaward. But how could I pass the enemy and escape into open water stern first? It was an impossible maneuver. I signaled the escort vessel to move forward slowly and continuously fire flares. This way, I hoped to force the torpedo boats into deeper water where I could dive away. But as soon as we gained speed, I saw over a dozen small shadows attacking from about 800 meters away. I acted immediately. "Both diesels flank speed ahead. Rudder hard to port." U-953 turned reluctantly, presenting its broadside to the attacking torpedo boats for what felt like an eternity. As U-953 finally completed the turn, our guns began to bark. We raced back to the harbor at top speed, spoiling the Tommy's chance to fire a full load of torpedoes at us. The small boats, faster than us, closed in quickly. In the flickering light of the flares, we saw them zigzagging towards us, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the little devils turned away and vanished towards the open sea. This incident shattered my hope of breaking out that night, or any other night for that matter. The small torpedo carriers were not the only danger. Their unexpected appearance suggested the presence of a strong destroyer fleet. It seemed our return to Brest was irrevocable. We were doomed to scuttle our boat and share the fate of the besieged city. As U-953 snuck back into the inner harbor and slipped into its berth, dawn was already breaking. I ordered the men to keep away from the dock workers and not to utter a word about our nightly adventure. For the second time in a day, I closed the green curtain of my alcove and thought about a way to get us out of this trap. There was only one option. I had to leave the harbor submerged, a maneuver that, due to the low water level, mines and strong currents, was dangerous and had never been attempted before. I intended to break out at high tide, drift through the narrow exit channel without an escort vessel, and dive as soon as I had enough depth under the keel. With only 1 or 2 meters of water over the conning tower, we could glide into the open sea under the cover of ebb tide. While 100 men slept soundly, fully trusting in my ability to lead them to freedom, I got up from my leather mattress. On my way to see Winter, I walked through the deserted dockyard facilities. I found the man in the underground tunnel amidst his staff. Winter was very serious and looked tired. I reported the torpedo boat incident to him and described how I planned to outsmart the Tommies. He wished me luck and successful transfer voyage to La Rochelle for the second time and added, "Would you like to accompany me on an inspection tour through the trenches?" "Captain, I must decline. I need to prepare for the coming night and haven't slept in days." With a hint of a smile, Winter said, "Then you might miss something that no one will be able to share with posterity." Then, hiding his movement, he added with casual roughness, "Keep your ears stiff and your head high. I can't say goodbye to you. My duty keeps me here." We shook hands again, and I left him with the clear feeling that I would never see him again. On August the 17th at 2:55 p.m. I pulled back the green curtain, put on my leather jacket, went into the darkened control room, and again urged my chief engineer to dive very carefully when I felt the time and moment were right. Then I took my place on the bridge. 3 a.m. I pulled U-953 out of the bunker, and as the boat silently slipped into the summer night and headed towards this narrow fairway, I saw the shadowy city astern. The harbor, with its vast dock facilities, outlined a bizarre silhouette against the night sky. And above it all were the blurred outlines of Brest, the city that was facing siege, destruction, and surrender in a short time. Now, perhaps for the first time, I felt that everything was irrevocably lost. That glory, successes, triumphs, and victory celebrations were over forever. The past could never be rebuilt, and U-953 drifted past the abandoned underwater net and slipped like a ghost ship into the narrow channel that led to the Bay of Biscay and to the Atlantic. The dark backdrop of mountains and cliffs concealed our escape. At 3:35, when the tide was at its highest, we slipped over the shallow bottom through the channel to the west. I relied on my memory and steered the boat slowly and cautiously towards the waiting torpedo boats. As the sky in the east showed the first light, we recognized the small boats lying motionless ahead on the flat water, mere dots in a purple sea, and the water was still not deep enough to dive. I moved with the slowest revolutions and with the electric engines only to avoid any noise, showing the enemy our narrowest silhouette. A hint of dawn announced the twilight as we drifted towards the blockade. Then suddenly, I saw movement in the rigid formation of the torpedo boats as they darted over the calm surface and repositioned themselves behind the rocks on either side of the exit. At this moment, we had reached the limit of our above-water advance. At 4:23, the vents were opened, the boat let out a strong groan, and the bow quickly submerged. For a few seconds, I observed the movements of the small boats, and then water poured into the horseshoe of the conning tower. I slammed the hatch shut and heard the water gurgling and quickly enveloping the boat. Loud, high-pitched propeller noises broke the surface. The fast torpedo boat started excitedly through the calm sea, and after the chief engineer trimmed the boat, I began my pre-calculated measures. I submerged the boat down to 15 meters and ordered the slowest stealth speed. 3 depth charges detonated at some distance. 4:40 a.m. U-953 sank to 20 meters, and a large number of these swift boats crisscrossed above our overloaded dive tubes. They threw hand grenades to scare us, which was quite an old trick. It didn't work. 5:08 a.m. 6 depth charges exploded ahead on the starboard side. Countless shrill propellers cut through the water like saws, and we sat with bated breath, sweating and calculating in the damp coffin. 5:20. A series of 12 detonations echoed seaward. Aztec pulses chirped through the shallow depth, and a new series of depth charges thundered ahead, rolled through the coastal waters, and echoed for a long time. 6:45 a.m. The boat now submerged to 45 meters. The torpedo boat still crisscrossed far astern and continued throwing their hand grenades. Across the entire forward sector, from Casson to the southernmost cliffs of the mainland, the sea vibrated with the depth charges that the hunters were wasting indiscriminately. 7:30 a.m. We changed course to the southwest and brought the boat to 50 meters. 8:10 a.m. We had crept 12 nautical miles over the bottom, running aground on sandbanks several times, but each time the current had lifted us and gently pushed us over the uneven seabed into open water. A few miles ahead, 4 destroyers were zigzagging at low speed. To starboard, another search group was probing the depths for the fugitive. 9 a.m. New course, 200 degrees, depth 65 meters. Unable to see or orient myself otherwise, I steered the boat with intuition and lots of feelings. With the electric engines turned off, I let the boat drift on a cushion of air and with the outgoing ebb tide in a southerly direction. Aztec pulses hit our steel hull with increasing intensity. The search activity of the anti-submarine groups on the surface increased by the hour. 9:40 am. Ebb tide. Slack water. The chief engineer set the boat's nose into the sandy bottom, 85 meters below the Hunter's keels. Around us, the nervously spinning screws of several destroyers whipped the water. They circled, stopped, listened, dropped depth charges, regrouped, advanced, stopped again, listened, and threw their barrels again, slowly rolling us towards the rocks and turning our tube into a torture chamber. 12 p.m. U-953 had turned its bow into the current and gently rocked like a pendulum. Explosions and propeller noises kept every man at the highest readiness. Grey, muddy water full of algae laid a protective layer over our boat. 4:30 p.m. The tides turned. The current flowed seawards, and U-953 lifted its nose and resumed its silent journey over the bottom. Wrapped in a rattling, chirping veil of 1,000 noises, the boat gently slipped into the Bay of Biscay. As the noise slowly subsided, we knew we had escaped the trap. We were free, but still prisoners of our own hell. A foul smell of fuel and lubricating oil mixed with the sweat of many bodies and overflowing sanitary containers filled the narrow confines of our steel tube. Some of the shipyard engineers vomited into the bilges and collapsed exhausted onto the deck. August the 18th, 3 a.m. It was high time to use the snorkel and ventilate the boat. This process allowed us to run our diesels underwater, a novelty I had long sought. The chief engineer brought the boat to 14 meters, raised the air mast and then ventilated. With a long sigh, fresh sea air flowed into our sweating hull, eardrums cracked sharply under the pressure equalization. The diesels began to sputter and within seconds sucked the stale air out of the boat. The technical performance was convincing, the total submarine was here. We were no longer forced to surface for air and power and thus risking our destruction. Life in the dive tube had become bearable again. We hurriedly recharged our exhausted batteries and drifted submerged through the enemy-controlled Bay of Biscay. We stopped our diesels at irregular intervals to listen to the sea around us. This was an extraordinarily important measure. It allowed us to detect anti-submarine groups or individual destroyers that had located our position and course and were trying to align themselves with our extended general course to greet us with a deadly load of depth charges. Relying solely on the man at the listening device, I steered the boat just a few meters below the surface through the hell of the Bay of Biscay. The droning diesels betrayed to any enemy within listening range that we had escaped the blockade around Brest. Our snorkel had protruded just a few centimeters above a lethargic summer sea. We crept south with the utmost attention, and when the new day appeared in the glassy eye of the extended periscope, I ceased snorkeling. The periscope was retracted, the snorkel mast laid down, and U-953 steered to a depth of 40 meters. As the sun made its daily course, U-953 moved deeper into the bay. At noon, I changed the course to southeast. The long underwater journey without navigational charts, exposed to currents and tides, blind and unable to orient myself, was a seafaring challenge unknown before. While the crew listened to distant explosions or dozed off at battle stations from exhaustion, I bent over the sea chart at my small desk, calculating my chances of sneaking into the trap of La Rochelle. At midnight, we cautiously extended the snorkel and the tip of the periscope out of the water, and our noisy diesels announced to the world that we were still alive. However, no low-flying planes detected our bright parts, which my chief engineer skillfully danced on the surface. As the fourth night of our escape to the south ended and the morning of August the 20th hesitantly dawned over the Bay of Biscay, I believed we had reached the southernmost point of our march. I decided to make a run for the coast, and 5 hours later, pursued by weak but persistent propeller noises, U-953 gently touched the bottom at a depth of 48 meters. I brought the boat to periscope depth and soon distinguished a thin dark line in the morning mist to the east. Land. A careful all-around look, and there, on the hazy northern horizon, I spotted the tops of masts and some smokestacks of several destroyers lying in wait. We had accidentally steered right back to the hunters. 1:20 p.m. The periscope eye broke through the murky, muddy water again. The coast suddenly stood like a wall before the boat. We were too close to land and too close for our safety. To avoid being washed ashore by the current, I immediately ordered hard to port, new course 320 degrees. Soon after, I sighted the lighthouse on the northern tip of Ile d'Oléron. A squadron of 6 twin-engine planes came flying low. I quickly retracted the periscope and let them pass. 3 minutes later, the sky was clear again. I took several bearings from the lighthouse and Bruns, my chief navigator, plotted course and speed. We discovered a strong current to the north, and I knew that I couldn't hold the boat in this strong current until nightfall, when the darkness would allow me to surface and enter the Bay of La Rochelle under its cover. The boat had reached the point where some of my comrades had been sunk just days earlier. I let myself fall from the tower into the control room and began studying the sea chart. The sea chart detailed the coastal waters around the islands at the entrance, and the Ile de Ré on the north side of the entrance had gained dubious fame. The old fortress of Saint Martin had once been a stopover on the way to damnation. From here, the French government had transported its hardened criminals and political prisoners to Devil's Island in French Guiana. I grounded the boat. The bow audibly dug into the coastal sand, and with little buoyancy, U-953 barely swayed in the current. The crunching of the sand against the pressure hull was clearly audible in the boat. The same went for the propeller noises of the English anti-submarine group gathered at a respectable distance from our coastal defense at the entrance. 2 hours after sunset, we surfaced. The night was impenetrably black. The lighthouse, which had ceased its peacetime lighting years ago, was gone. Assuming the current had pushed us north, I turned the bow into the current and, with silent electric motors, headed south. Silently, without drawing the attention of the destroyers to me or triggering any acoustic mines under the keel, the boat fought against the current. 7 minutes later, the tall, thin lighthouse blurred into my night glass. I recognized it as the sought-after tower on the northern end of Ile d'Oléron, sent a stream of bearings to Bruns in the tower, and relied entirely on his skill to navigate the boat through the narrow channel into the harbor of La Rochelle. "Time to turn east. New course, 115 degrees, Bruns suggested. "Hard to port, new course, 115 degrees, I ordered the helmsman. As U-953 silently turned towards the land, I felt as though we were heading straight for the bottom. Then, suddenly, a grinding and scraping, a slight jolt, and the boat was indeed stuck in the mud. "Compressed air to all cells, both engines full power astern," I immediately commanded. The boat lifted, and the wildly spinning propellers pulled it out of the sand and back into deeper water. Ignoring the destroyers, I ordered the sonar to be turned on and to continuously sound the depths. After several courses in total darkness, I believed I had found the channel and followed an eastern course, occasionally touching the bottom. Using the sonar to trace the contour of the seabed, we slowly crept into the bay, and the lighthouse disappeared astern into the blackness of the night. 4 hours of intense feeling and searching passed. I was unable to make out any point on land and began to doubt the correctness of my actions. As the bottom steadily and inexorably approached our keel, I became even more suspicious. Then came the moment when we had no more room to maneuver. I circled the boat several times but encountered the bottom everywhere. Dawn began to break and fog rolled in. Intending to hold position until the sun burned off the white mass and I could take some bearings from the land, I ordered the anchor dropped. 7:40. The fog covered seas and land, leaving only the higher parts of the coast visible. Then suddenly, the white veil lifted, evaporated, and the coast appeared all around us. The boat lay like a duck in a pond. I immediately ordered the anchor raised, compared the sea chart with the nautical guide and the points on land. But then, an explosion tore the morning stillness apart. A fountain shot up about 100 meters to port into the blue morning air. The deep boom of a gun followed shortly after. We were being fired upon by our own artillery. "We are being challenged from shore. They demand the identification signal," reported the leading seaman. "Take the signal lamp and send out the recognition signal, quick. Give them our boat number and tell them to notify base that we will be at the pickup point at 2300 hours. The fact was clear. I had entered the wrong bay. Since I had no intention of allowing us to be shot down like a sitting duck from the air, I ordered the chief to dive immediately. With a light impact, the boat settled into the soft mud, and only 2 meters of the grey sandy water covered the top edge of the bridge, and the tide had just reached its highest point. My promise to be in port before midnight was more than optimistic. It couldn't be denied. During the night, I had mistakenly taken the lighthouse on the northern end of Ile de Ré for the lighthouse on the northern tip of Ile d'Oléron. Since the previous day I had positively identified the correct lighthouse, I concluded that we had been drifted northward by the strong current over the unlikely distance of 17 nautical miles. Unbeknownst to us, we had passed through the mined entrance of La Rochelle, where 3 of our boats had been destroyed the previous week. Because unlit lighthouses cannot be distinguished from each other at night, I had no reason to doubt my assumption. I had taken my bearings from the wrong lighthouse and had sailed into the bay before Pontius Breton. The entrance to this bay has the same characteristic features as the one leading into the port of La Rochelle. I squeezed onto the attack periscope seat and allowed the glass eye to look just centimeters above the surface. I was paralyzed by the constant falling of the water, which would eventually expose us and subject us to aerial attack. I wondered how long I would be allowed to observe the bay and the landscape through the periscope before the eager bombers used us as a target. Outside, near the lighthouse of Ile-de-Ré, 3 aircraft were skimming the surface. Simultaneously, the bridge structure slowly emerged from the silvery surface of the bay. With a sweaty face, I watched as the water level dropped inch by inch, revealing more and more of the tower. Finally, at 1400 hours, it was low tide. Soon, the water began to rise, millimeter by millimeter. I was so hypnotized by the British aircraft arrogantly circling outside at sea that I didn't notice the water closing over the bridge again. I snapped out of my trance when the periscope eye was washed over and disappeared beneath the surface. Relieved, I wiped the sweat from my forehead and neck and sank into the metal plates of the control room floor. For the rest of the afternoon, I played skat with the chief and the watch officer, always prepared in case one of the bees discovered the shadow of the boat in the shallow water and ended our lives with a well-aimed charge. 1330 hours. U-953 disengaged from the bottom and surfaced. Again, the night was moonless. We sped out at the unfriendly bay with thundering diesels, passed the lighthouse, raced half a mile seaward, turned south and hammered parallel to the beach of Ile-de-Ré towards the entrance to the port of La Rochelle. The shadows of the destroyers followed us, confused by our reckless surfacing. After what seemed like an endless hour, pursued by detections and shadowy silhouettes, we reached the deep channel between the islands. I immediately stopped the diesels and switched to electric motors. Soon we spotted the silhouette of a small minesweeper. After exchanging recognition signals, the boat hurried back towards the harbor with rattling sonar. 6 mines exploded one after another in close proximity to the vessel, bringing the last men from our boat on deck. At 0230 hours on Tuesday, August the 22nd, U-953 slipped into the berth in the bunker of La Palisse. It was one of the few boats that had managed to shift to the southern base. The aromatic scent of coffee beans and the soft rustling of bakers passing the coffee through the blocked central ale woke me up. I pushed aside the green curtain and turned on the small headlamp. Refreshed soon by the strong brew, I left the boat and bunker to report my arrival to the commander of the 3rd U-boat flotilla. I saw only 2 old boats rusted and damaged in the bunker, and signs of abandonment were clearly visible everywhere. I reached the end of the cool, dark bunker and stepped into the humid morning air. A short ride in a Citroën quickly brought me into the medieval city of La Rochelle. The car stopped in front of a 2-story building downtown. Armed guards escorted me to the office of the flotilla commander. A medium-sized officer in a faded khaki uniform rose from behind his desk. He said, "I've been expecting you. I also know about your unusual arrival. We've been open all weekend and you didn't need to wait until today to come in. You were lucky our artillery understood your signal. They usually don't. They are ordered to shoot at anything trying to land, and they thought initially an English U-boat was about to drop off saboteurs. You see, we are well prepared for a landing." He paused. "Are you expecting a landing, Captain?" I asked. "Of course. The Allies will likely attempt to attack from the sea, but our guns will spoil their fun quickly. We have some advantages over Brest and Lorient." With brief words, he described the efforts of all Wehrmacht units to strengthen the defense of the city. Our front on the Bay of Biscay coast was slowly falling back, and the naval defense of La Rochelle anticipated a large influx of heavy artillery, tanks, and infantry who would relieve the sailors from their unfamiliar land duties. The commander urged me to promptly send my surplus crew from U-415, the engineers and technicians, to the adjutant for their transport to Germany. He would arrange for their onward journey, and all equipment and devices that we had wrested from the Allied Axis were to be loaded onto trucks and transported to German ports without further delay. The boat must be ready for a new operation by the weekend. 4 days of downtime is all I can grant you, concluded the flotilla commander. "Sir, I need more than 4 days," I replied, surprised. "My batteries and diesel engines were supposed to have been replaced months ago. I was assured in Brest that I would receive new batteries here in La Palisse. That was the main reason I made the journey here. The capacity of the old batteries has fallen well below permissible levels." "I'm very sorry, but you've been misinformed," he said firmly. We have no spare parts, no supply of any kind. I truly regret it, but you'll have to wait until you get to Norway to replace your batteries and diesel engines." I swallowed my frustration and excused myself. In the condition the boat was in, a journey to Norway would likely end on the bottom of the Atlantic rather than in a Norwegian fjord. And in 4 workdays, we couldn't even carry out the most essential repairs necessary for the boat's safety. The short journey from Brest to La Pallice had already revealed countless deficiencies. They would undoubtedly become dangerously exacerbated the longer they went untreated or unattended. Upon my return to the bunker, the boat and the crew, I immediately began preparing for my long voyage to the cold north. I briefed my new officers on the urgent deadline, and I also discovered that almost all of the German shipyard personnel had fled and the French dock workers had scattered to avoid the looming danger. Therefore, I ordered the entire crew to work diligently to have U-953 ready for action by the set deadline. An industrious activity unfolded on board and at the pier where our boat had found temporary refuge. The bulky cargo that had so adversely affected our boat's routine was brought into the daylight and loaded onto trucks. The drivers stood impatiently and nervously beside their vehicles. They were visibly eager to head east. The situation in the harbor reflected the confusion spreading across the French hinterland. The Allies, advancing with strong mechanized units in all directions, had made significant progress during our journey transfer. In Brittany, American units had overrun the city of Nantes and were marching rapidly along the coast towards the south. Paris had fallen into Allied hands on August 24th, much to the joy of the French population. Along the Côte d'Azur, the attackers had taken Toulon, conquered Marseille, thus smashing our centers of resistance in southern France. Everywhere in the German-occupied territories, saboteurs and groups of the French underground movement were gaining strength. Supported and equipped by Anglo-American air supply, they cut off our defenses and supply lines and ambushed our retreat routes in the rear. Railways and roads became targets of Allied bombing raids, fighter planes strafed the long columns streaming from the western ports with their onboard weapons. Thousands of men, untrained in land combat, sailors and civilians, technicians and office staff, shipyards employees and workers could not defend themselves against ambushes and aerial attacks and were mowed down en masse. Some marching groups dwindled to a pitiful handful of refugees who eventually forced their way through forests and fields to Germany, living off what nature provided. 25,000 men managed to break out of La Rochelle and the southern ports during these days of general retreat. Among them were my men from U-415, along with hundreds of sailors from other boats that could no longer be made ready for sea. In Lorient and Bordeaux, the crews of U-123, U-129, U-178 and U-188 scuttled their glorious old boats before embarking on the march into misery. Their escape through hostile France led them through a hell of humiliation and destruction. Only a few reached the German border. The rest either ended up dead or mutilated in the ditches of France and behind barbed wire. Thus, in La Rochelle, the submarine tragedy came to an end, albeit somewhat belatedly. U-260 sailed at the end of August with the intention of also heading for Norway. It was one of the few boats to break through the blockade and reach Norway, and it later perished in a minefield near the southern Irish coast. And once again, our author has been kissed by luck, as we tend to say around here. But his biggest challenge is yet to come. We will learn about it in the next episode. See you then, cheers and bye bye.